City of Chicago has always been known for its great architecture, amazing buildings, amazing skyline, huge sports teams, and of course the Grand Lake Michigan. But one thing a lot of us don't know is that underneath Lake Michigan is miles and miles and miles of tunnels. Today we're going to discover what's actually underneath Lake Michigan. When it came down to bringing a product for this channel, I really wanted to bring something forth that really captivated what this podcast has been all about and something that my everyday supporters can use in their everyday life. Me personally, I like to smoke while I learn and while I gain more knowledge and while I'm working. And an ashtray was the most perfect way for me to captivate a product that really shows forth what we do here at the Session Podcast and what I do in my everyday life. Purchasing one of these ashtrays goes directly into supporting this podcast, helping us with better equipment, better cameras, better sound quality, better guests. That way, we're able to bring you guys the best content. We have ashtrays in multiple sizes, multiple colorways, and we can even create a custom colorway for you. We'll get the purchasing link put down in the bio. That way you guys can check out the ashtrays and support our channel. If you guys want to see more things and more merch, check out the purchasing link in the bio, where we'll be updating it every week. City of Chicago, formally founded on paperwork 1833, was one of the most fastest growing cities. It was huge. There was a lot of people settling there at the time. However, in the mid-19th century, Chicago ran into a huge number of problems that almost made Chicago inhabitable. The Midwest, also known as the Great Plains, is one of the most flat lands here in America. Throughout Illinois, Chicago, most parts of Michigan and Wisconsin are pretty flat. You can pretty much get where you need to go, and we're talking even in settler times, pretty good. But Chicago sits right on the lake, which is everything for transport, trade, health, food, water. The lake was the most abundant source of fresh water. Actually, the Lake Michigan accounts for about 1/5 of the world's surface fresh water, the entire world. So Lake Michigan is actually a very important piece to America, because America, Canada, and other surrounding areas, about 40 million people depend on this water. So as Chicago was becoming a great city, it ran into a couple of issues. One of those issues being waterborne diseases, such as cholera. And since the city of Chicago, in these flat lands, it was sat pretty parallel with Lake Michigan. So you can imagine most cities, they either go up or down, rise a little bit above sea level or so. That way, the water levels stay at bay. However, in Chicago, it's pretty parallel. It's pretty flat. So what you'd have is a huge number of problems with rain, snow, things like that, causing massive floods. These floods would cause huge problems because if you know anything about Chicago's layout, the main portion of its downtown and the main portion of its city runs along the lake. And when it would flood, it would raise these lake water levels, and the waters would just completely flood the streets, bringing up water. The streets, obviously, at that time were pretty muddy, so it would make streets pretty impassable, and things like that. You'd have to wait for things to dry just to get things done. Basically, Chicago was pretty much like sitting on a swamp, like swampy lands. And actually, if you go further south Illinois and see some of these forest preserves, you can find evidence of these like wetlands when it rains, and you can see that how the land just kind of holds water. There's not many hills and peaks and valleys, so it's a prime place to actually just hold a bunch of water. Now, the other main cause, these these waterborne illnesses rather, that I'm talking about, one of the main ones was cholera. Now, cholera posed a huge problem. It resulted in a huge death toll, and it pretty much knocked on the door of wiping out the city. You got to think, at that time, there was no proper sewage, proper like waste management. So people were dumping their waste from, their homes, their urine and their poop, essentially. They were throwing their waste into the Chicago River, the lake, and the Chicago River was one of the main sources of drinking, dumping waste, and even recreation things like swimming probably. And people, they use this water. And so the Chicago River being the main source of like water and things like that, it highly contaminated the lake. So when it would flood and these rainfalls and huge snowstorms would come in, all of that feces and contaminated water and things like that would literally float up into like your door or your sidewalk, or it would flood your basement, or it would flood your alleyway, or it would flood your front lawn and things like that. And what people didn't realize is that over time, drinking this water, they would become sick. So there were huge cholera outbreaks, and the city just had to do something about it. So there were a few things that the city did about it. One of the first things that the city did was raise their street levels. Now, Chicago's been known for doing some amazing feats, and this might have to have been one of the greatest feats it's accomplished, but we're going to do a full-on video about Chicago raising its street levels later. If you guys want to see that, let me know in the comments. We'll do some research and some digging on that. But early to mid-late 1800s, Chicago decided that they were going to lift up the city. In doing so, they actually lifted up the city. They would put jacks underneath buildings, have countless men turn these jacks all at once, and they would raise these buildings in order to raise the city's level away from the water, to avoid flooding and these waterway problems that they were having, being that close to Lake Michigan. And that was an amazing feat within its own, to just not say forget about this city, it's too wet, it's too muddy, people are dying. Instead, they saw the potential that Chicago had, probably being more so like a hub from the west and the east. So they built it up. They literally raised these buildings. They jacked them up, put them up a few feet, 14 or so feet there was, I think it was. And then they, now the city actually does sit higher than the lake. If you go to the lake, and when you go out, you actually do sit higher than the lake. And at one point, that was not the case. Another way, fixing not only just the problem of, the fecal matter and the flooding, was to fix the actual drinkable water, right? So if you were still having problems with cholera, you fixed the flooding by raising the city, but we also needed to fix the water that's drinkable. So let's get into these tunnels. So in order to fix the problem of sanitation and water, they actually used tunnel boring machines and went around the seabed and underneath to the seafloor, under the seabed, using tunnel boring machines, drilling through like rock formations in the seabed in order to build these things called water cribs. So now how these tunnels worked was these water cribs were built with these filtration systems that filtered out major debris from the water sources. This would then send water through those tunnels onto stations that sat offshore or onshore, and these stations basically made sure that the water got sent efficiently to the water pump stations. These water pumps, or these water stations, would clean the water and distribute them out to the city. And it's also worked the same for waste. Wastewater would be sent, filtered out, and then sent back into the lake. So this was one of the most amazing feats, and it's still being done today. Yes, even today, they are still building massive tunnels underneath Chicago's Lake Michigan. It's a current project called TARP, and the plan is to have about 109 miles underneath Lake Michigan. And it's also a cool thing to know that these water cribs actually employed men who actually lived in them while they worked up until about 1990s. So yeah, it's not even all that far off from when they were constructing these problems in the 1800s. And Chicago's waterways has been one of the biggest, most impressive things, in history. If you really look into it, the TARP project has massive massive tunnels. I mean, these tunnels are huge. There are huge reservoirs all throughout the city. We could do a whole episode on TARP and their projects later, so you guys can really learn about what is going on. They don't plan to be done until about 2029, which will be about a 57-year project. But overall, these tunnels underneath Lake Michigan widely contributed to Chicago sustaining as a city. People even living here, wanting to live here, wanting to move here. And it's a piece of history that a lot of people who live here in Chicago, like myself, or throughout the world, might not know about. Chicago also just has a vast amount of tunnel systems, from the trains to some of these streetways like Lower Wacker Drive and Lower Wacker Drive. We could do more videos on more of the tunnels in Chicago later. But actually digging underneath the lake bed in order to access the least contaminated water, filter it, send it back to the shore, filter it again for human consumption, and then pumping it out throughout the city. At that time was just one of the most amazing feats that humans could have not possibly accomplished before this city's time. It's definitely one of the most amazing feats that I think we've accomplished, is getting our waterworks. If you guys want to learn anything more about Chicago, like I said, about these tunnels, some more things that we got, more history, I can look into it. Put your suggestions and anything you guys want me to cover in the comments. You can do more Chicago history, any other type of history, or anything you guys want me to cover. Share it with me. I really like to make more videos that you guys would like. That's a brief summary about Chicago's tunnels underneath Lake Michigan. It's water cribs, it's water filtration, and how we save the city from dying from cholera. Like, subscribe, comment. It really helps this channel. It really helps us build this channel more. It's your boy Zoda Session, signing out.